By 1944, German generals were beginning to confront a reality they had long refused to see. The enemy they had faced in 1939, quick and overconfident, was gone. Europe had fallen, Paris had surrendered, and the Blitzkrieg had seemed unstoppable. Yet across the Atlantic, an entirely different force was taking shape, one that could not be beaten by clever maneuvers or elite soldiers alone. It was the power of American industry, mobilized as a weapon in its own right. Factories that once produced cars and tractors now churned out tanks, planes, and artillery with astonishing speed. Every airfield bombed reappeared almost overnight. Every supply convoy sunk was replaced by another. The numbers were staggering. American tank production alone had reached tens of thousands per year. For every Panzer the Germans destroyed, 10 Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines in Detroit, Flint, and Toledo. Ships built in American yards crossed the Atlantic, carrying men, fuel, and equipment faster than the German Navy could intercept. Railroads and ports on both sides of the ocean functioned like clockwork, moving armies and supplies with industrial precision. The Germans, used to controlling the pace of battle, were suddenly one step behind, reacting to a tide of men and machines they could not hope to stop. The psychological effect was profound. German officers who had once prided themselves on tactical brilliance began to see patterns that filled them with unease. Battles that were supposed to be decisive became endless stalemates. Ambushes and counterattacks seemed to spring from nowhere, fueled by reinforcements that appeared faster than they could believe. Attrition, the slow wearing down of an enemy, was no longer an option. Every American loss was inconsequential because the replacements came faster than the Germans could count. Reports from the front reinforced the fear. Soldiers spoke of seemingly endless columns of Sherman tanks, trucks overflowing with supplies, and aircraft arriving with almost mechanical precision. German generals whispered among themselves in disbelief. "We are fighting a country that never tires," one said. Another admitted, "Every time we destroy one unit, 10 more appear in its place." The realization settled like a shadow. This was not just an army, they were confronting the industrial might of an entire continent. Even infrastructure alone became a weapon. Shipyards, rail networks, and factories were all designed for war. Ports were fortified and streamlined to unload thousands of tons of supplies daily. Every destroyed bridge or rail line was rebuilt within days. Every attempt to slow the Americans was met with an almost supernatural response. Tanks, planes, and troops arriving in numbers no human mind could fully grasp. German generals, accustomed to thinking in terms of weeks or months, now faced a war measured in days and hours. By the summer of 1944, the truth could no longer be ignored. Strategy and maneuver alone could not overcome this relentless force. American industry was the backbone of the Allied war effort, the engine driving every successful operation in Europe. German generals had conquered nations before, but now they were facing an opponent whose strength was inexhaustible, whose resilience seemed limitless, and whose production could replace any loss almost instantly. The idea of a final victory became harder to imagine with every convoy that reached England, every Sherman tank that rolled into France, and every factory line that kept the war alive. When the first American troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, it was more than a military operation. It was the culmination of an industrial revolution of war. German commanders saw what they could no longer ignore. They were not fighting soldiers alone. They were fighting steel, oil, factories, and determination on a scale Europe had never seen. The German generals who once prided themselves on foresight now found themselves reacting, improvising, and ultimately witnessing the rise of a power they could not hope to defeat. The Germans were facing a continent's worth of industry, and for the first time, they knew that no strategy on Earth could overcome it. By 1944, the American tank factories were running at full tilt, producing machines faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Sherman tank, which would become the backbone of the U.S. armored divisions, rolled off assembly lines in staggering numbers. Detroit, Flint, Toledo, and other industrial hubs had transformed from civilian cities into enormous engines of war, their factories humming day and night, turning steel, rubber, and oil into armored might. For every Panzer destroyed on the battlefield, 10 more Shermans were waiting to take its place. The numbers alone were enough to overwhelm even the most experienced German commanders. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank in terms of armor or firepower. Against the formidable German Panthers and Tigers, it was often outgunned, but its true strength lay in quantity and reliability. While a Tiger might take months to produce and a Panther weeks, the United States could crank out hundreds of Shermans every month. Speed and consistency became weapons themselves. A constant stream of tanks arriving on the battlefield meant that German commanders could never rely on a single success to change the course of the war. Each victory was fleeting because the Americans could replace losses faster than Germany could exploit them. Logistics played a crucial role. Tanks did not appear by magic on the beaches of Normandy or in the hedgerows of France. Each Sherman required a massive supply chain, from raw steel to engines, turrets, and ammunition. Every component was carefully coordinated across factories, rail lines, and ports. Liberty ships carried thousands of tons of equipment across the Atlantic. Rail networks moved them inland with precision. Soldiers and crews were trained simultaneously, ensuring that every tank had a driver, a gunner, and a commander ready to fight. Germany could destroy a single tank or even a division, but the Americans had already built and shipped replacements. The pace was relentless, unceasing, and impossible for the Germans to match. The psychological impact on the German generals was profound. They had been trained to respect enemy tactics and morale, to analyze strategy and timing. But here, strategy alone seemed insufficient. Battles where they destroyed dozens of tanks were only temporary victories. A week later, American armor arrived in numbers too great to count. Officers spoke in disbelief about the sheer volume of reinforcements, about columns of Shermans stretching as far as the eye could see. One veteran reportedly remarked that it felt like the Americans had an endless supply of steel, and every time we destroyed one, 10 more appeared behind it. The generals were fighting a number they could not outmaneuver, a tide they could not stop. American innovation extended beyond production numbers. The Sherman itself was designed to be easily repaired and modified. Field crews could swap engines, repair tracks, and replace damaged weapons with astonishing speed. Some were modified with heavier guns or additional armor to meet specific battlefield challenges. This flexibility, combined with raw numbers, made the Shermans almost impossible to neutralize completely. A single tank lost was rarely a permanent setback. For every machine destroyed, more were ready, sometimes in less than a day. The impact of this industrial flood was seen most clearly during the battles following D-Day. German units, expecting to face limited American armored divisions, were shocked by the constant stream of tanks. Counterattacks were often repelled simply because new Shermans replaced losses before the Germans could capitalize on openings. The Americans did not just fight, they outlasted, outproduced, and outmaneuvered the Axis in ways that strategy alone could not achieve. It became increasingly clear that the war in Europe was not just a contest of tactics or bravery, it was a test of production, logistics, and resilience. By the summer of 1944, the Sherman flood had become emblematic of American industrial power. It represented a war machine fueled not just by weapons and soldiers, but by the factories, engineers, and workers behind them. German generals could destroy tanks in the field, but the relentless output meant that every destruction was temporary.
The battlefield had become a demonstration of a new kind of warfare, one in which steel, speed, and production determined the outcome as much as bullets or strategy. German commanders began to admit, quietly and reluctantly, that they were facing more than tanks. They were confronting an industrial force that replaced losses faster than they could inflict them, that moved with logistical precision, and that seemed unstoppable. The Sherman, often underestimated in its capabilities, became the symbol of this new reality. It was simple, reliable, and mass-produced, a mechanical answer to the German challenge, backed by the full weight of American ingenuity and industry. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the reality was undeniable. The German generals who had conquered Europe with tactical brilliance were now fighting a flood of armor they could not stop. Each Sherman represented more than a machine. It represented the power of a continent's industry, the speed of logistics, and the determination of a nation that would not be defeated. The tide of steel was endless, and for the first time, Germany faced an opponent whose advantage lay not on the battlefield alone, but in factories, assembly lines, and ports that never ceased to produce, supply, and sustain.
By 1944, the American military machine had become more than just soldiers and tanks. It had become a logistical marvel. The Germans were beginning to understand that in every engagement, it was not only the men who mattered, but the invisible networks that fed them. Supply chains, airfields, ports, and railroads were just as crucial as any battlefield maneuver. Every operation, every assault depended on the precise delivery of fuel, ammunition, and food. And the Americans had mastered it all with astonishing efficiency. Across the Atlantic, massive convoys carried thousands of tons of equipment and personnel to Europe every week. U-boats and Luftwaffe attacks inflicted losses, but for every convoy sunk, 3 more arrived to take its place. German intelligence began to report the scale of what they were up against. They saw ships unloading endless supplies in ports that seemed prepared for a permanent army. Roads and railways bustling with trucks and trains carrying tanks, artillery, and reinforcements. The Americans had built a web of logistics so powerful that it allowed them to sustain operations over vast distances with surgical precision. Airfields became symbols of this unstoppable power. In areas recently liberated from German control, engineers and soldiers worked together to construct landing strips almost overnight. Fighter planes, bombers, and transport aircraft could take off within hours of completion, providing air support, reconnaissance, and supply drops. For the Germans, every airfield destroyed was only temporary. Within days, a new runway would appear, fully equipped, fully operational, and ready to support operations. The Germans, accustomed to crippling infrastructure to slow their enemies, found that nothing they destroyed could halt the Americans for long. The American logistics system was more than just supply. It was adaptability in motion. When fuel shortages threatened operations, pipelines were constructed. When roads were destroyed, trucks rerouted themselves across secondary routes. When ports were congested, auxiliary harbors were built. Everything moved with speed and precision, ensuring that soldiers never lacked what they needed and tanks and artillery never waited idly for ammunition. The Germans could no longer predict or control the flow of reinforcements. Every offensive was met not by exhaustion, but by fresh troops, fresh armor, and fresh supplies arriving just in time to counterattack. The psychological effect on German generals was profound. They were trained to understand tactics, strategy, and the human element of warfare, but this was something entirely different. Battles became less about skill and more about whether they could keep up with an industrial and logistical torrent that seemed to have no end. Reports from the front described entire divisions arriving within days, sometimes faster than German reconnaissance could confirm. Each supply truck, each rail car, each Liberty ship arriving at port was another blow to the German expectation that the Allies could be exhausted or starved out. Even small details mattered.
Ammunition was never in short supply. Artillery could fire continuously for days because shells were delivered almost as quickly as they were spent. Medical supplies and field hospitals kept soldiers in the fight. Engineers cleared roads, repaired bridges, and ensured that tanks and trucks could move without delay. The Germans, who often relied on disrupting supply lines to weaken the enemy, discovered that the Americans' ability to repair, reroute, and resupply was nearly unstoppable. It was a war of motion and material, where speed, coordination, and organization mattered as much as courage on the battlefield. American logistics extended beyond Europe itself. The United States' industrial heartland, thousands of miles away, fed every operation with incredible consistency. Every plane built in a factory in California, every Sherman tank assembled in Michigan, every truck and gun produced in the Midwest was connected to a vast supply network capable of delivering it to the front lines within weeks. German generals who had once relied on outmaneuvering opponents now found themselves helpless against the sheer scale of production combined with flawless delivery. The battlefield was no longer a place where a single tactical victory could change the course of a campaign. It had become a theater where logistics and industrial might defined success. By the time the Allied forces landed in Normandy, the full impact of American logistics was visible. Ports swarmed with troops and material, roads and railways carried endless streams of reinforcements, and airfields bristled with aircraft ready to strike, scout, and resupply. For the Germans, every German general understood that no tactical brilliance could counter the momentum of this system. Every plan they made, every counterattack they launched, was met not with exhaustion, but by fresh forces that arrived faster than they could destroy them. The Americans were no longer just an army, they were a force sustained and amplified by a continent's worth of industry, supply, and ingenuity.
By 1944, the United States had transformed its entire economy into a weapon of war. Factories that had once produced cars, tractors, and household goods were now churning out tanks, planes, guns, and ammunition at a pace no nation had ever seen. Detroit, Pittsburgh, and other industrial hubs had become battlefronts without soldiers, where steel, oil, and human labor combined to form an army capable of sustaining campaigns across the world. The Germans began to realize the staggering truth. They were not fighting just soldiers or weapons. They were fighting factories, assembly lines, and the relentless force of production itself. The numbers were overwhelming. By the summer of 1944, American aircraft production had exceeded 96,000 planes since the war began. Tank output reached tens of thousands annually, dwarfing Germany's ability to replace losses in the field. Every Sherman, every fighter plane, every artillery piece represented the output of thousands of workers, engineers, and technicians working around the clock. The Germans could destroy dozens of tanks in battle, but the factories ensured that dozens more would roll off the lines the next day. This constant, unyielding production created an advantage no tactical maneuver could ever match. The Americans had mastered not just quantity, but efficiency and adaptability. Factories were retooled quickly to produce new weapons as the battlefield demanded. When tanks needed heavier guns, assembly lines adapted. When aircraft required reinforced armor or improved engines, engineers redesigned them without halting production. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, aware that each tank, each plane, each shell was a soldier in its own right. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on precision and quality, now faced the overwhelming advantage of speed combined with adaptability. Shipyards became another axis of power. Liberty ships, designed for rapid construction, were launched faster than the Germans could sink them.
Each vessel carried thousands of tons of supplies, tanks, vehicles, and troops to the European theater. Ports swelled with material arriving continuously, fed by an industrial network that spanned an entire continent. The Germans had no way to halt this flow. Bombing factories or ports could slow production temporarily, but within weeks, repairs and replacements would restore capacity. The Americans' industrial momentum was unstoppable. The psychological effect on German generals was profound. They had conquered nations before, relied on speed, strategy, and tactical brilliance to overwhelm their enemies, but against the United States, these skills seemed almost irrelevant. Every plan to weaken the Allies was met by fresh tanks, new artillery, and planes arriving faster than they could be destroyed. One report from a German officer noted that it felt like the Americans had an endless conveyor belt of steel coming at them, replacing every loss almost instantly. The scale and speed of production created a war in which the Germans could never gain permanent advantage. This industrial superiority extended beyond weapons. The Americans produced uniforms, boots, medical supplies, fuel, and food on a massive scale. Soldiers never lacked what they needed to fight and survive. Engineers and mechanics ensured that vehicles and artillery could be repaired quickly, often on the battlefield itself. Logistics, production, and supply combined into a single, unstoppable system. German commanders began to see that the enemy they faced was not just an army, it was a machine powered by factories, sustained by supply, and protected by the full weight of a nation mobilized for war. The effect on battles was immediate and visible. During the Normandy campaign, German forces were confronted with waves of armor, artillery, and air support that seemed endless. Every counterattack the Germans launched met new American reinforcements, new tanks, and new planes. The Germans could destroy divisions, but they could not destroy the industrial network that created them. Strategy alone was no longer sufficient. The battlefield had shifted from men and weapons to the power of production. Victory depended as much on factories and assembly lines as on courage and tactics. By the summer of 1944, the phrase "fighting a factory" had taken on a terrifying meaning for German commanders. Each Sherman tank, each B-17 bomber, each Liberty ship was more than equipment. It was a symbol of American industrial might. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt had called it, was no longer an abstract concept. It was a tangible, overwhelming force that Germany could not hope to match. The generals who had once relied on precision and maneuver now faced a reality in which their losses could be replaced faster than they could inflict them. The war was no longer simply fought on battlefields. It was fought in steel, oil, sweat, and ingenuity. By the time the Allies advanced through France and into Germany, the reality was undeniable. The Germans were confronting a nation whose factories, workers, and engineers were as important as soldiers on the front lines. Every weapon destroyed was soon replaced. Every plane shot down was soon accompanied by another. Every tank lost in battle was replaced by 10 more rolling off the assembly line. German generals understood the chilling truth. They were not fighting an army, they were fighting the industrial might of a continent, and no strategy on earth could stop it.
By June 1944, the Germans faced what they had long feared, the full scale of American power. On D-Day, thousands of Allied ships crossed the English Channel, carrying men, tanks, artillery, and supplies. For German generals, the beaches of Normandy became a terrifying confirmation of reality. They were not facing just soldiers, they were facing an army sustained by a continent's industry. Every landing craft, every Sherman tank, every plane represented months of relentless production, thousands of workers in factories, and a supply chain that stretched across the Atlantic. German fortifications built to repel invaders were overwhelmed. Bunkers, mines, and artillery positions were destroyed, only for reinforcements to arrive almost immediately. Sherman tanks, artillery, and troops continued to pour ashore, replacing losses faster than the Germans could calculate. Every plan to slow or halt the advance was met with an unending stream of men and machines. The generals realized this was no ordinary battle. It was an operation fueled by factories, ports, and assembly lines, and their calculations of attrition were failing. American logistics worked with almost mechanical precision. Mulberry harbors, temporary portable ports, allowed continuous unloading of men and supplies. Roads were repaired, bridges rebuilt, and railways cleared so fuel, ammunition, and troops could move inland without delay. Every tank lost could be replaced within days. Every wounded soldier could be replaced within weeks. German commanders watched helplessly as each counterattack they launched was met by fresh men, tanks, and artillery, arriving just in time to maintain momentum. Air power amplified the advantage. Allied planes dominated the skies, providing cover for the landings, attacking German positions, and supporting advancing troops. Every airfield damaged or bombed was quickly repaired, sometimes overnight, allowing planes to continue operations without pause. German generals could plan defenses, launch counterattacks, or attempt to regroup, but the relentless flow of American reinforcements and material made each effort increasingly futile. The psychological impact was devastating. Officers whispered in disbelief in their war rooms. "We cannot stop them," one said. "They arrive faster than we can destroy them." Another admitted, "Every time we push them back, more appear behind us." This was not simply a battle of men, it was a war waged by steel, oil, and ingenuity. Factories produced weapons faster than they could be destroyed, ports handled thousands of tons of supplies daily, and railways moved men and material with clockwork reliability. The Germans were confronting an opponent whose strength came not just from tactics alone, but from the full weight of a nation's industry. As the Allies pushed inland, the pattern became undeniable. Defensive lines were broken not just by skillful maneuvers, but by the constant arrival of reinforcements. Every loss the Americans suffered was temporary. Every gain they achieved was immediately matched by fresh tanks, artillery, and soldiers. German commanders found that no plan, no counterattack, no local victory could change the momentum. They were fighting not only an army, but an entire system designed to replace losses faster than they could inflict them. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the lesson was impossible to ignore. D-Day and the weeks that followed proved that German generals were facing a new reality. They had conquered nations before, relying on speed, cunning, and tactical brilliance, but they had never faced an opponent whose strength was drawn from entire factories, ports, and supply chains. Every Sherman tank, every Liberty ship, every aircraft symbolized not just material, but the power of a nation fully mobilized for war. By the time the Allies advanced into Germany, the generals understood the truth. They were not fighting an army, they were fighting a factory the size of a continent, and there was no strategy on earth that could stop it.